All right, welcome everyone, especially those who are listening by way of Facebook. And we thank you for joining us and for being a part of Gateway Baptist Church's evening service. And as we have been doing for the last several months, we are starting out with a small devotional. That's my part. And we are looking into the chapters that deal with creation and the immediate aftermath of the creation. And I would, I think in not too many weeks hence, we're going to look into the chapters that deal with the flood too. But I have to go through those and pick and choose manually to a great extent because I've got an awful lot of information on them. And there is no way that before the rapture we have time to go through everything that we could go through just looking at the past. There is new information, literally, arising year after year after year. Things that we speculated about when I was in Bible college 40-something or another years ago that we know for a fact now. There was information that we had then that was important, but we've been able to build on it since then. There have been at least 6 reported sightings of the ark, and the ark has never been found. They're not factual. We don't believe any of them, but every one of them does suggest an element that could possibly lend some information that would be credible and important. And so we're going to look at some of those things in future weeks, but I want to finish up here with Genesis 4 and 5. We're looking at Cain and Abel still. We're about to finish, we're in the corridor between Cain and Abel and Seth. And I just want to make a few comments that would review what we've already said regarding the principle of sin and what it leads to. We know what it led to with Cain is that he became very jealous and wroth with his brother Abel and killed him. And he buried him in the ground, and the Lord confronted him with it and addressed the subject of his anger and the reason for it. And basically, we realize in looking at the exchange between the Lord and Cain that there was absolutely no justifiable reason for his anger. Now, let me just say this. Anger is not always misplaced. Anger is not always the wrong response. As long as we can, as the Apostle Paul put it, be angry and sin not. Okay? We have to evaluate our anger. We have to evaluate our hearts. We have to evaluate our motives and our actions. It is a very common principle in business and also a very necessary principle in the Christian life that we continually evaluate. And I took a course called The Educational Work of the Church. Mr. Marlon Savage was our professor, and he says the very first step in establishing any kind of a ministry is to evaluate. Now, there's a lot to evaluate. When Brother Ross or myself or someone else stands up here, we're evaluating. We're evaluating whether our message is going to come through the way we hope it will, whether God is behind it, or whether we're just up here to make noise. We evaluate our audience. We are constantly looking to see if everyone is attentive, if anyone is getting it, and you can tell from the faces that this is a wonderful group. It's not a very large group, but this is a group that pays attention. This is a group where we have people who are taking notes. You wouldn't believe, unless you've got here, what an encouragement that is to the speaker. Because we know that you are interested in what we are telling you that God said in His Word, and you're interested enough to want that in your life, to write it down so you don't forget it, so you can pass it on to others. And we're evaluating all of that. Well, he said the first step is to evaluate. The second step is to start out. The third step is to evaluate. The fourth step is to continue. The fifth step is to evaluate. The sixth step is to do whatever's next. The seventh step is to evaluate. You see a theme building here? We have to evaluate continually and constantly in the Christian life to examine ourselves, to examine the situation, to examine our motives, to examine our actions, to examine our faith and our display of faith before the Lord. Cain was not real good in evaluating. Certainly not himself. Certainly not what the reason was behind the rejection of his offering and himself, and God receiving Abel and his offering. He was not able to put two and two together and say that God blesses those who love Him, and He doesn't bless those who show something other than love and an affinity for the things of God. So since Cain did not seem to have developed that ability, he made wrong choices. And in making wrong choices, he received the penalty for God's displeasure rather than the blessing of God's pleasure. And you and I, all of us, everyone, are being evaluated by God on that very same scale. So it is essential that we examine ourselves so that we know when we stand before God that we can stand there with confidence and not be ashamed and not having to shrink back and say, let me get this right before I can come. If you have aught against your brother, get it right with him before you leave your offering. Okay? Make sure that you're on good terms with God. Then you will be on good terms with God's people. Make sure you're on good terms with God, and you know what you are doing then is liable to fall within that realm of being pleasing to God. We know what God wants. He wrote us this love letter, this book, to tell us what He wants. He sent us His own Son, His only begotten Son, the monogenes, the only begotten Son of God, so that we would recognize in Him the love, the affection, the desire of God to have fellowship with those who would believe. That's the purpose Jesus came. He said, I came into the world Well, Paul said Jesus came into the world to save sinners. Then he added a little caveat, with whom I am chief. Now, you and I would examine the life of the Apostle Paul and would not call him the chief of sinners. But Paul knew his own heart. He knew his own mind. And to him, he stands before God as one who is guilty and unworthy. And so do I. And so does everyone who will stand before God. Now, sin. Sin takes away judgment. And I mean by judgment, discernment. You make bad choices, bad decisions. That's in verses 8 and 9. Reason completely disappears, and we end up with what Jude talks about in verse 11 of his book, the way of Cain. The way of Cain is the way without faith. It's a reactionary course instead of being a course that is responsive. Now, when we commit ourselves to Christ, when we commit our daily activities to Christ, our living to Christ, then we are responding to the love of Christ. He loved us first, we loved him second. John said that in his first epistle. And therefore, we need to be responsive in our lives, in our faith, instead of being reactionary, such as Cain was, made the wrong decisions. Compassion completely disintegrates. His compassion for his brother completely fell apart. Sin makes us argumentative, as he was. He came and talked with his brother, it said, and then he slew it. The word talked there means to argue, to speak with force. He was attacking in his words. And then he attacked physically. What he didn't attack was his own sin. He didn't attack his own thoughts and his own feelings. I hate to use that word, but feelings do enter into the picture, don't they? And he didn't bring any of that before the throne of God and say, Lord, I've got all these things, and I know it's not right. What do I need to do in order to make it right? And that would have been that. He didn't do that. He instead acted upon the feelings and the thoughts and the bad judgment and his jealousy, and he slew his brother. There was discovery. God says the very blood of Abel is calling out to me from the ground. It's a foolish thing to try to hide things from God. It's hard enough to hide things from people. Because believe me, if you can remember it or you know about it, somebody else will. Sometime, somehow. And God always knows. God knew his heart better than he did. And he knew that he was going to fall into sin. He knew when he fell into sin. He knew that he would cover it up. He knew when he was covering it up. He gave him a choice, and he didn't take it. He took the low road, not the high road. And so God put a mark upon him so that he would not be avenged or revenged by others in the family, and there were obviously others in the family. I don't think that he and Abel were the only two. They were the only named two. They may have been the first two. But they were the two that God needed in order to give us the object lesson that we so desperately need. And so they're the two who are named. And there will be a third one here in a little bit, as we already alluded to, Seth. And then there's a description of Cain's family, and I won't get anywhere near that this time around, or any of the couple of things I brought to read to you. I'll read them to you next week. But I did want to close with this thought from Vance Havner. Dr. Vance Havner was one of the most quotable country preachers that I've ever stolen quotes from. And I like this one. Vance Havner was talking about sin, and he said, sin will take you farther than you want to go. It will keep you longer than you want to stay. And it will cost you more than you want to pay. Boy, isn't that true? That is absolutely true. The resulting effect of sin is hard, but the resulting effect of sin, though it's hard, doesn't need to be permanent. God is a God of great mercy. He's the God of matchless grace. He's the God of forgiveness. He's the God of as many second chances as it takes for you to fall down on your knees and give your life to Him, and then spend the rest of your life living for Him, with Him, in Him, through Him, and any other preposition you can think of. They all apply. Thank you very much.